Oh man, here they come again.
Here they come again. This still has skin on the skull.
Here is a history of claims and evidence that spanned centuries. That doesn't exist in these other places. And so it really is remarkable to me that, I mean, that's part of what I was trying to do with the book, is that hopefully someone, whether they're a devoted student of the subject or not, but especially someone who's new to it, could read this and say, like, I had no idea that there was so much to this subject. Like, there has to be something going on, even if it's some collection of all the above, like biological, psychological, an interplay between the two. But to me, it's like, it's just, I don't know how someone could dismiss the possibility that, like, no, these things are real living animals, because we had them in our near history. In that way, if you look at the Asian ape line, again, that produced Indopithecus and Gigantopithecus, especially Gigantopithecus, because it was contemporaneous with the genus Homo for over 2 million years. It's like the Sasquatch phenomenon has already happened once, just the other day on the other side of the pond. And so the only question for me is, like, well, is it still happening now? Like, did any of these things get into North America? Because we know they were in Asia. And are they still around today? If either of those two questions is yes, then boom, there's your Sasquatch, you know?
Yeah.
So sorry to derail there.
No, you're good. You're good. You're describing and laying out a very convincing argument for their existence, which I appreciate a lot. With you talking about this stuff, it kind of popped in my head. And I don't even know, because this isn't a well thought out thought. It just popped in my head. I don't even know if this would be an argument for or against or in the middle. But have you come across the idea and pondered the idea when it comes to the interconnectedness, consciousness level of a human being, and how, you know, people, if people want to make the argument that Bigfoot's not real, it's just a construct of the imagination, and it's like some kind of like hive mind type thing amongst humans. And you were talking about how it's not consistent throughout the whole world, which is a great argument for that. The other side of that would be, what if there is some kind of quantum type of connection amongst humans when it comes to this thing? And I can't speak highly intelligent about quantum level physics and stuff, but I know that they'll say things like, if there's an atom in New Jersey and there's another atom in California, they're connected on a quantum level and simultaneously will do the exact same thing. And, you know, could there be, and you probably don't even have an answer for this, but it's just like one of those things, thinking out loud, could there be some kind of quantum level connection amongst certain humans that allowed for this mental, do I dare call it a disorder? Like some kind of mental thing where they're connected and they're actually having the same experience. I don't know. Like I just, the idea of quantum physics is well beyond my comprehension. And what I do understand confuses the heck out of me. And I just figured I'd bring it up there because it just popped up in my head when you were talking.
Yeah, I don't understand anything within the quantum realm whatsoever. I don't think we understand very much about consciousness itself. I mean, I think once again, like, we can observe the behaviors of our psyche or of what seems to be our consciousness, and we can make inferences, but we can't, you know, that's one of the great unknowns. And so I certainly am not qualified to weigh in on those things, but they're interesting. You know, I'm somewhat familiar with the concept of entanglement, but man, I don't understand quantum physics or any of that stuff, quantum mechanics at all. But what I would say is, like, another argument for it really being something in the external world to me is, like, when you travel around so much and you investigate so many cases and reports, especially within given places, like, one of the things that's always fascinated me with these sort of flaps that occur in places and times. Like, there's one that comes to mind that I referenced briefly in the book that happened in Georgia, where it seemed like, now maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse and telling the story this way, but, or I'll just tell it chronologically. So essentially, we had received a report where a man and a woman that he lived with, I think she was his girlfriend. I don't think they were married, but she might as well have been his wife. You know, they lived together. They were a couple for a long time. Unfortunately, he's passed away since then, but they had, you know, this crazy night at their home where It's a pretty interesting story, so I'll condense it quickly. But he was at home. He had little small dogs in his backyard. This is a big, giant dude. It was kind of funny because he was a real sweetheart of a guy, and he loved these little dogs. But he was a bouncer and a construction worker, and just big, gnarly, tough dude. I mean, he's probably like 6'4" or something. Big, massive dude. And so, but he had these little dogs that he loved, and little dogs are in his backyard with a little small dog fence, like 4 feet tall, maybe. And he went outside at night to call them in. And while he was calling them, he could hear something walking around the edge of his fence. And he thought that it was a person. And he had this little shed just inside of his fence that he just kept like a bunch of his tools and things like that in. And so he thought in his mind, like, oh, there's kids. They're trying to break into my tool shed and steal stuff. And so he's like yelling at this thing. Hey, I can hear you out there, blah, 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 making threats. And it starts growling at him. And he's like, oh, these smart ass kids are trying to scare me on my own property. And it's funny because this guy was in his underwear. He's in his like tidy whities, So he goes back in his house, gets his sidearm, comes back in the yard, starts yelling again, and it growls again. And he fires a few rounds into the ground, just warning shots. And the thing screamed and charged him. And he said it just sounded like it was just smashing everything in its path. And this dude was mortified, just terrified, ran back inside. At this point, his girlfriend's like wide awake because she's heard this scream just outside the window. She's like, what the hell was that? And he's like, I don't know what that was. I thought it was kids, yada, yada. And so they laid inside, and it was stomping around the edge of the yard, like thrashing stuff and tearing stuff up. And so eventually, when the sun came up, they went outside to like survey the damage, and they could see all these broken limbs and branches and things of that nature. And we're sort of following this path of destruction. And then they both heard a sound as they're following this down into this wooded area. I mean, it's pretty thick there. They look up, and he only caught a glimpse of it, what seemed to be its back. But he said it was up in the air, vertical, but it was like a 3x3 square foot patch of cinnamon brown fur moving away through the foliage, like this big, huge back. But he didn't get to see, like the arms or the head or anything. And it just freaked him out. And that's when he called, and myself and some people visited the property. We saw the sign and the impressions and things like that. Because he was like, man, this thing was still there. He said, I've never had an animal run towards gunfire. Like this thing was pissed off, and it didn't leave. It was still there in the morning, and he's like, am I in danger? And so around this time, we're putting together this sort of investigation, this report that's going to be published online. And then these other calls are coming in from these people that, later investigation, we find out don't know each other at all. They have no connections, who are seeing, roughly the same time within like a week and a half, 2-week period, roughly the same height and the same cinnamon red, sort of cinnamon brown colored individual that when you plot these sites, like it's following this waterway and it's just running into homes. And the interesting thing is like, this waterway and a lot of these homes were recent additions. They're just built up in the last 5-8 years, if memory serves correctly. And so, if you had gone through that area a decade or 15 years ago, you would have just been following a waterway through heavily forested areas. So it's sort of newer development. And so you would think, well, if it's strictly psychological somehow, or something in the inner world, like, what are the odds that all these people would be having the same inner experience around the same time, following like a certain trajectory, and they're imagining, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, what seems to be the same individual? Because it's not like someone saw a black one and someone saw a gray one and someone saw a red one and someone saw a blonde one. Like they all saw what seemed to be like this big reddish male. And in almost every encounter, it was fairly confrontational. Like it wasn't aggressive. Because this guy yelled at it and it growled back, and he made some loud sounds at it, shooting shots in the ground, and it made some loud sounds back. It was pretty confrontational, but it's not like it tried to rip the guy's arms off. There was another sighting, by an individual who was driving with his family, his wife and his kids. They were coming back from dinner in town and saw, standing in the road, this big reddish, 7.5, 8 foot tall, whatever, this Sasquatch that just stood there in the road, and the guy stopped his car. I'm trying to remember what his background was. He was a military guy and we had interviewed him and got a lot of his, sort of accomplishments and credentials. And I think he had gone through sniper school. Might have been at Fort Benning, but I could be wrong about that because it's been a number of years. But anyway, like he had completed sniper school. So when someone like that tells you like, oh, it was this many yards away, you know that they're pretty accurate, you know? So he described it. And this thing just stood there in the road, stared them down to the point that he backed his car up and they went back the way they came to go find another way home. Cause he was like, I wasn't going to roll another inch closer to this thing, even though it was like 30 or 40 yards away. If I'm remembering correctly, it just wouldn't move. Like it was not afraid of this car. And the guy was like, I'm not driving anywhere closer to it. And then there was another encounter, you know, not too far away at the edge of the swamp, same description, same individual. And so there's flaps like that throughout the history of Sasquatchery, you know, like now that you're in Tennessee, I don't know if you read much about like the Flintville monster, kind of South Tennessee, close to the Alabama border, that section of like the Southern Cumberland Plateau, descriptions of what seemed to be the same individual. And very often when you read a lot of these, they seem to be like lone males who are moving through territory that they don't seem to be too familiar with, because it's not like they're maintaining like the path of you know, the being the most hidden or the most sort of subversive. Exactly. It's like they're just following a waterway and like running into people here and there and like, where do I go? Where do I go? Until they find their way into some larger forested area, which we now know, like, well, many other animals live that kind of lifestyle. As young males strike out and they have to sort of establish their own territories of their own home ranges. Of course, they're going to spend some time going through unfamiliar territory. And that's what will lead to a lot of people seeing them. And then you could see in the pre-discovery history of gorillas. I mean, in George Schaller's book, The Mountain Gorilla, Behavior and Ecology, I think is the subtitle, but he had conducted the first observational field studies of mountain gorillas. And he had found that in trying to piece together this sort of pre-discovery history of these things, and like what is it that we know about them before these observational studies? Well, first of all, it was thought that they were solitary, which we know gorillas aren't solitary. They live in family groups, you know, sometimes these big, large troops. But the reason it was thought that they were solitary is like most sightings were of lone males that would come hang around the edge of these human habitation areas. And Schaller basically surmised and laid out a case in this book that what had happened is that as human progress reached into these areas and they would establish these essentially industry. So mining camps, logging camps, mining and logging operations, things of that nature. They would cut down all this forest that would basically reduce gorilla habitat and it would run away the gorillas. And so then as the young males grew up into adulthood and they had to sort of strike out on their own to establish their own places, their own home ranges and territories, although gorillas aren't really territorial. But that's neither here nor there, but they had to establish their own ranges. They would return back to the places where they grew up, essentially. And there they would find like these encampments. And so that was most people's experience with mountain gorillas, would be like one big lone male hanging out at the edge of a logging camp or a mining camp or the edge of crops or cultivated food sources, skulking around and generally like scaring the hell out of people. It's like, well, you look at the history of Sasquatch reports and like the same thing is pretty well true, that like most of the history of Sasquatchery is like lone males being seen at the edge of like, you know, rural agricultural homesteads and farms at the edge of these towns, etc. And very often you'd think, well, maybe there's something of that nature going on. And that when these lone males do have to move around, that's when they make the most errors because they're inserting themselves into unfamiliar territory. They don't know where the safe havens are. They don't know how to avoid areas of like human ingress or egress, etc. And so all of those factors, to me, it's like more and more and more stack up that there's something biological living going on rather than just psychological. Because again, you would think that if it was something internal, whether or not something that's perceived internally, let's say, like whether it is some kind of quantum entanglement or something out there in the ether, but not physical, something that has to be interpreted. Like, it's just amazing that it still follows all these rules and trends and norms that we can find in the biology and the ecology of apes. You know, it's just, there's something going on, you know?
Yeah. No, that's
my
fascinating.
perspective.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. When you were talking about the flaps of that one instance with the red fur Sasquatch, and I'll just say it was a Sasquatch. I think we all know it was. So one, I want to get, what was it like for you during that time as somebody who's a researcher trying to find truth of the matter? What did it feel like during that stretch of time where you're getting these reports and you're connecting dots and it's like, sure, this is amazing. Like this is a once in a lifetime scenario. This doesn't happen all the time. It's kind of, I always use the example for myself is, and it's changed since then, but the first time I ever heard a Bigfoot out in the woods, I was stunned, thought I'd never experience that again. And when I found out the microphone on our camera was broken and we didn't catch it on audio, I was depressed. I was like, that's never going to happen for me again. And so like in that moment, like you're having these reports coming in, like I would be going berserk. I'd be like, this is incredible. What did it feel like for you? And then I kind of want to dive into the fur color itself. Have you ever either thought about this or come across it through descriptions where it seems like maybe the different types of colors that these things are kind of play into how they act? Because I personally heard that red fur Sasquatch tend to be more aggressive. I don't know if you've ever heard that, but I'm interested in all that I just laid out.
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked both those questions because I was going to write more about, hair color in the book. So I'm glad we get to talk about that here. To the first question, the reason I smile and laugh as you're asking that is like, I was so naive and stupid that no, I didn't appreciate like, oh my God, this is a once in a lifetime thing. I thought like, oh, this happens all the time, like, cause I started this when I was really young. So when I started interviewing witnesses, I was 20. And when I really started going out in the field, I was about 22. And by the time I joined the BFRO and was taking a lot of reports, I was, I think, what year I would just barely 25, 24, turning 25, And so it's sort of like the other thing too, like when I was young, I played in a major label band, which was a huge deal to me because it was one of my favorite bands that I got to join. But like at the same time, part of me thought like, oh, of course, like, this is just what happens, like we're always going to be together. We're always going to play these big shows to these big crowds. We're always going to have a record deal. We're always going to have these opportunities, It's only when you get older and you look back and you're like, it's a miracle that any of that ever happened and that it stayed together for 5 seconds, let alone for, 5 minutes or whatever the case may be. And so I look back at a lot of these Sasquatch related cases or opportunities that I was fortunate enough to be a part of that I either got lucky or stumbled into or just like dumb luck, right place, right time. And I just want to like kick myself for thinking like, oh yeah, I'll get reports like this all the time. Like this is just the way life is now, blah, 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 blah. So at the time I didn't fully appreciate it. Now I've always really valued witnesses and hearing people's experiences and being there, I mean, there's really something transformative about, as like talking to people. I mean, it's because it's what you do, no matter how much of, a skeptic or a cynic you can be about a certain thing, in the privacy of like your own head, let's say, when you start talking with people about their experiences, when they're convincing, because, we'll never know, like, do they believe what they're saying? Are they lying to me? Are they convinced? Are they delusional? Are they being, I don't know. All I can do is use my best judgment. And like, man, when you hear a compelling story that your judgment tells you is probably true, like it's transformative. There's many times